So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you are just arriving, again, welcome. Feel free to say hi in the chat. And I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Mackenzie White, who is the Public Health Manager at Environmental Health Project. Take it away, Mackenzie.
All right, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. As Jamila said, I am Mackenzie White. I am the Public Health Manager for the Environmental Health Project. I'm one of the, I think I'm the newest member of the team, so if anyone's familiar with our organization, I will probably be a new face to you all. I have a background in public health as well as social work, and I am really excited to be here tonight with you all. So for anyone who might not be familiar with the Environmental Health Project, or EHP, we are a public health nonprofit organization that provides wide-ranging support to communities impacted by shale gas and oil development. That support includes health impact assessments, environmental and health monitoring, data and research interpretation, and public health guidance. EHP's team includes a varied and skilled group of healthcare providers, scientists, community educators, analysts, and communications experts. The strength of the organization lies in part in its direct contact with community members, learning about their circumstances and responding to their need for relevant information and guidance. The organization opened in 2012 and today is at an exciting juncture as we have expanded our focus beyond Southwestern PA. We seek to support communities more broadly in understanding the exposures and risks generated by shale gas and oil development, and also to engage in policy dialogues at the local, state, and national levels regarding the public health implications of shale gas and oil activities. We have become national leaders in the comprehensive understanding of and approach to public health consequences in shale gas and oil development. This evening, we'll be discussing PFAS, endocrine disruption, and shale gas development. Every day, almost all Americans are exposed to a select group of toxic substances that have been linked to a variety of health concerns, including but not limited to cancer, endocrine disruption, and increased susceptibility to infectious diseases such as COVID-19. These substances are known as PFAS, which is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This class of toxins includes more than 4,000 different substances. This evening, we'll be hearing from two different experts who do work and research around PFAS. We are going to start our evening with Dusty Horwitt, who will discuss the use of these in terms of shale gas development. Just a small housekeeping note before we get started. As Jamila mentioned, we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. However, I do encourage everyone to put their questions in the chat as they come up so that we can use those to start our Q&A. If you have a question for a certain speaker, I also encourage you to note which speaker it's for to help me in terms of processing all the questions. So our first speaker for the evening is Dusty Horwitt. Dusty has spent 15 years researching and working to protect communities from the health and environmental impacts of oil and gas drilling and fracking. An attorney and former reporter, he has written a chapter on fracking chemical disclosure for a textbook published by Elsevier. He has also been quoted and his work has been featured in media outlets including the New York Times, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Wall Street Journal, and Marketplace on NPR. He has played significant roles in efforts to protect New York State, the George Washington National Forest, and the Delaware River Basin from unsafe shale gas drilling and fracking. He is currently a consultant with Physicians for Social Responsibility and authored a report on the use of PFAS in oil and gas extraction, published by PSR in July. We will provide a link to this document in the chat for any who are interested. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dusty for his presentation.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie, and thanks to the Environmental Health Project and Halt the Harm for hosting this event. I'm going to talk about the findings of the report that I wrote for Physicians for Social Responsibility that we published in July, showing the link between PFAS and oil and gas extraction. I'm going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that? Is that good, Mackenzie?
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks. So our report found evidence that PFAS, known by the longer name per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or chemicals that could break down into PFAS, known as PFAS precursors, have been used for hydraulic fracturing or fracking in 6 states and in more than 1,200 wells in those states. And those states included Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and Wyoming. We found that this use had occurred between 2012 and 2020. These chemicals, PFAS, may have been used more widely in oil and gas extraction, but we can't know for sure how widely they were used because of the lack of full disclosure of chemicals used in the oil and gas industry. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's a big hurdle for people's right to know and for protecting people's health. PFAS, for those who are unfamiliar, are highly toxic. They're bioaccumulative, that is, they accumulate inside all of us. The blood of everyone who has been tested for PFAS has shown that, or the blood of everyone tested has shown some levels of PFAS, and they're toxic, bioaccumulative, and they're persistent in the environment because of their chemical structure, which includes a bond between carbon and fluorine atoms. They're very resistant to breaking down in the environment. That is one of the most resistant or strongest chemical bonds known. We found that more than 130 oil and gas companies had reported using chemicals that were PFAS or could break down into PFAS in fracking, including companies that have operated in Pennsylvania. Those companies include ExxonMobil and its subsidiary, in particular XTO Energy, Chevron Corporation, and Anadarko. All 3 of those have operated in Pennsylvania, even though we did not find in this report that these chemicals had been used in Pennsylvania. But there is some concern that they might have been because those 3 companies operate in the state. And a couple of weeks after our report was published, the Philadelphia Inquirer's editorial board did its own investigation and found that 8 wells in Pennsylvania had indeed been hydraulically fractured with a different type of PFAS than the ones that we identified in our report. And so we're going to be looking into that further because we think that there may have been more use of PFAS even than what we identified, both geographically in different states, as well as in different parts of the oil and gas extraction process, including drilling, which precedes fracking. The other 2 companies listed that we found as having used PFAS are EOG Resources. They're a major producer of shale oil, and Canacorp, which used to be one of Canada's largest oil and gas producing companies until they moved to the United States. I want to emphasize that our report marked the first time that the use of PFAS in oil and gas extraction has been publicized. PFAS have been a well-known contaminant for about 20 years, since around the year 2000, when an attorney named Rob Bilott filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of people living in and around Parkersburg, West Virginia, who believed that they were getting sick and their water was being contaminated by PFAS-related pollution. And that lawsuit revealed that some of the makers and users of PFAS, especially the chemical companies 3M and DuPont, had known for years that these chemicals were toxic, bioaccumulative, and persistent, but they had failed to sound the alarm. Meanwhile, they made millions of dollars or billions of dollars even in profits as these chemicals were used throughout the economy in everything from firefighting foam to stain-resistant carpeting. Perhaps the most high-profile use was in non-stick Teflon-coated pans and other products. And so these chemicals have been very widely used. The pollution problem is pervasive. And now we know that there is yet another route of potential exposure to these highly toxic chemicals, which is oil and gas extraction. We're very concerned about the use of these chemicals in oil and gas extraction, largely because of the health risks that they pose. We already know that there are some 1,600 chemicals that EPA has identified as being used in fracking or as showing up in wastewater produced by fracking operations. Some of those chemicals we know are toxic, including benzene, which is a known human carcinogen, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, which are benzene's cousins, which are neurotoxic. They can have negative effects on balance and memory. There is radium, another carcinogen, which often comes out of wells in the Marcellus Shale region. It is found naturally occurring in the shale, and thousands of feet underground, it's not a problem. But when it comes up in the wastewater, and that wastewater has to be disposed of, then it can come in contact with people. And that radium is toxic, is carcinogenic for thousands of years. So that's a big problem. And the fact that PFAS are being used in oil and gas extraction adds a very toxic, bioaccumulative and persistent chemical to this already long list of toxic chemicals. And so we're concerned that this may add to the health impacts that people have been experiencing and that the Environmental Health Project has been documenting along with others among people who live near oil and gas operations. Some of the health impacts we're most concerned about associated with PFAS include cancer, low infant birth weights, thyroid issues, high cholesterol, preeclampsia, which is a very serious condition affecting pregnant women, and ulcerative colitis, which is inflammation in the intestine. There's also some emerging concern that PFAS may reduce antibody responses to vaccines and infection resistance, or infectious disease resistance. And that's obviously a concern in the age of COVID. We are particularly concerned about disadvantaged communities that may be impacted. Studies have found that wells for oil and gas are often located in or adjacent to lower income communities, indigenous communities, communities of color. African Americans have been found to disproportionately live near fracking wells. There are also a number of most vulnerable people who could be negatively impacted by PFAS and the other chemicals associated with oil and gas extraction. Those include pregnant women, children, people with pre-existing medical conditions, elderly, first responders, and oil and gas field workers who may be working with these chemicals on a regular basis. As many people attending the webinar tonight may know, the Pennsylvania Attorney General released the results of a criminal grand jury investigation last year, and in particular raised concerns about chemical exposure among people living near oil and gas operations. This report was based on interviews with more than 70 families. And I just want to read a portion of this study, and I'll hold it up on the screen so you can see the cover of the study here. It's very well worth reading if you haven't read it. And the Attorney General's office found in part that many of those living in close proximity to a well pad began to become chronically and inexplicably sick. Pets died, farm animals that lived outside started miscarrying or giving birth to deformed offspring. But the worst was the children, who were most susceptible to the effects. Families went to their doctors for answers, but the doctors didn't know what to do. The unconventional oil and gas companies would not even identify the chemicals they were using so that they could be studied. The companies said the compounds were trade secrets and proprietary information. The absence of information created roadblocks to effective medical treatment. One family was told that doctors would discuss their hypotheses, but only if the information never left the room. It's absolutely outrageous that people have to live with these kind of health impacts and the uncertainty about what chemicals they might be exposed to. And now we know that PFAS may be one of those substances, which adds to the concern over the chemicals we already know about. There are a number of pathways through which people could be exposed. There are spills of chemicals at well sites. There can also be spills of the wastewater that comes out of the wells. As many people may know, a single well can generate more than 1 million gallons of wastewater over its life. That has to be taken somewhere. There can be intentional dumping of that wastewater. That's been documented. It can be treated and released at wastewater treatment plants that are not equipped to take out all of the contaminants, including perhaps PFAS, and that water can be released into waterways that serve as drinking water sources for people. One of the pathways that's not up on the screen I want to emphasize is the drilling process that happens before fracking, which is often overlooked in oil and gas operations. In drilling, the companies begin by boring down through the earth directly through the groundwater, which is typically in the first several hundred feet of the earth from the surface on down. And when they do that, they're doing that before they insert into the well any steel casing or cement that is designed to seal off that groundwater from the well so that chemicals can't get out into the groundwater and so that the groundwater can't get into the well. So if companies are using PFAS or other chemicals in the drilling process, in that first stage of drilling, those chemicals are likely to get directly into the groundwater and pollute that groundwater. There can also be some air pathways. There can be huge ground level pools of wastewater at the well sites where chemicals in that water can volatilize and become airborne. Some of the chemicals could be emitted when natural gas is flared at the wellhead. If chemicals get into people's drinking water inside people's homes, they can volatilize and get into the indoor air. So there are a number of air pathways. And as I mentioned, you can have spills both of wastewater and of the chemicals themselves at the well sites. PFAS have a number of specific concerns associated with them. As I mentioned, they don't break down. They're very resistant to break down in the environment. That's why they have the nickname forever chemicals. They can disperse widely in water. Cleanup is very expensive. Removal of PFAS, if they get into water, is very difficult. We talked to one expert in the state of Michigan who has worked for the state for years on cleaning up PFAS here in Michigan, where I live. Michigan has more than 100 identified sites of PFAS contaminated groundwater. And he said that you can filter PFAS out of water at great expense because you have to use activated carbon filters, and you have to use an enormous quantity of it. It's sort of like what is in a Brita filter on your countertop, but a much, much larger quantity of material. And he said that once that filter fills up with PFAS, then the question becomes, what do you do with it? Because as I mentioned, these chemicals don't break down. And he said that you could take it to a landfill, but some landfills are reluctant to accept it because they're worried about liability that they might face if the PFAS were to leach out of the landfill and pollute soil, groundwater, or other parts of the environment. Speaking of Michigan, Michigan recently set groundwater and drinking water standards for PFAS, and to give a sense of how toxic these chemicals are, according to their new standard for one type of PFAS, PFOA, in drinking water, PFOA is so toxic that one measuring cup of PFOA could contaminate almost 8 billion gallons of water. That's about as much water as New York City uses over 6 days. So a little bit of PFAS can go a very long way. Our investigation started when we reviewed some documents from the Environmental Protection Agency. Back in 2014, I was involved in sending a Freedom of Information request to EPA, asking the agency to provide us with chemicals that had gone through their new chemicals review program under the Toxic Substances Control Act that chemical companies have proposed for use in oil and gas drilling or fracking. In theory, under the new chemicals program, EPA is supposed to assess these chemicals for environmental and health risks before they go into commercial use, so that EPA can regulate these chemicals up to and including prohibiting their manufacture, so that people don't get sick and the environment doesn't get polluted before these chemicals get out into the world. So EPA gave us, over a number of years, thousands of pages of records. And we found recently in this digital mountain of documents that in 2011, EPA had reviewed 3 chemicals proposed for use in oil and gas drilling or fracking. And the regulators expressed concern that these chemicals could degrade into a substance similar to PFOA, which I just mentioned as being incredibly toxic. They were worried that these substances would also persist in the environment and bioaccumulate in people, wild animals, and birds. They also separately expressed significant health concerns about these chemicals, including liver toxicity, blood toxicity, male reproductive toxicity, immunosuppression, and oncogenicity, which is tumor formation. You can see it was very difficult to figure out what was going on in these records because the Toxic Substances Control Act allows chemical manufacturers to claim as trade secrets virtually any piece of information. On this slide, you can see that the chemical companies submitting these 3 chemicals for review withheld its own name as a trade secret. In addition, the company withheld as a trade secret the CAS number, or Chemical Abstracts Service Number, of these chemicals. The CAS number is considered by scientists the best way to identify chemicals, because a chemical can have multiple names or trade names, but it can have only one CAS number. And so if you're looking for chemicals in a fracking disclosure database, as Pennsylvania has, which I'll mention in a moment, it really helps to have that CAS number because you'll know exactly what you're looking for, and that was withheld in this case. despite all those concerns that these chemicals could break down into a PFOA-like substance, that they had multiple or could have multiple health effects associated with them, EPA allowed these chemicals to be used commercially, and one of the chemicals actually went into commercial use. And they did this with very lax regulation. They didn't call for tracking to determine where the chemicals were being used, or testing to see if pollution was occurring the way they thought that it might, that the chemicals might be breaking down into a PFOA-like substance. They did not require limits on the use of these chemicals in proximity to homes or drinking water supplies. And we don't know exactly why EPA allowed these chemicals to be used commercially with these lax regulations, but we suspect it might have something to do with EPA's dubious assumptions for regulating oil and gas chemicals, which include assumptions that these chemicals will never be released accidentally. That is, they're never going to leak, they're never going to spill, they're never going to migrate underground. And that is contradicted by evidence that EPA itself has accumulated, that fracking chemicals do leak and spill, and have, at least in the form of wastewater, have contaminated water supplies. So that may be the reason that EPA acted as it did. One of these chemicals, as I mentioned, did go into commercial use. It's called fluorinated acrylic alkylamino copolymer, which is a generic name for the chemical. Companies that withhold the specific identity or CAS number of these chemicals are required to provide a generic name so the public can have some idea of what chemical is being submitted through EPA's review. We searched for this chemical name in FrackFocus, which is a database of fracking chemical disclosure for more than 100,000, almost 200,000 wells across the United States, including in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania requires the operators of unconventional gas wells to submit fracking chemical disclosure to FrackFocus. Other states have similar requirements. We did not find this particular chemical listed in the database, but we did find 6 other chemicals with related names that a panel of scientific experts we share these names with identified as either PFAS or chemicals that could break down into PFAS. And these chemicals are listed below, starting with fluorinated benzoic salts. I won't read all the names, they're quite long, but I will say that the most commonly reported of these chemicals was the last one, non-ionic fluorosurfactant, and multiple misspellings of the same. That's also a generic name. So in most of these records, we couldn't know, and the chemical experts couldn't know exactly what chemicals were being used, which puts the public in a very difficult and unfair situation. There should be full disclosure of chemicals. But because of these trade secrets allowed at the federal level and trade secrets allowed at the state level in Pennsylvania and other states, multiple companies from the chemical manufacturers down through the well operators can withhold chemical identities from the public as trade secrets. In addition, in Pennsylvania and in most states, they don't have to disclose their drilling chemicals at all. Those are the chemicals used during the first stage of the extraction process, including when they're drilling right down through the groundwater. Those chemicals in Pennsylvania do not have to be disclosed. As far as I know, Ohio is the only state that requires that kind of disclosure. And there are other gaps in reporting requirements for chemicals as well. Our recommendations include that EPA and or state governments conduct a health assessment to see how people might be exposed to PFAS, that they test for PFAS in the environment near oil and gas operations and track where these chemicals have been used, that there be funding put aside for cleanup in the event that contamination is found, that there be full public disclosure of chemicals, including any PFAS used in oil and gas extraction, that there be a moratorium on PFAS use in oil and gas extraction, because these are highly risky chemicals, and the oil and gas extraction process is inherently risky and unpredictable, and the operators cannot fully control the chemicals that they use. So when we're talking about chemicals as dangerous as PFAS, it's simply too risky to use these in oil and gas operations. And finally, we called for limits on drilling and fracking, especially near drinking water supplies, schools, homes, and other areas where people and the environment could be significantly impacted. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions afterward and talk about some follow-up actions that people could take.
Thank you so much, Dusty, for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. As he mentioned, we'll have a chance for questions after Dr. Katie Pelch's talk. So if you have questions, again, you can put them in the chat box, and we are taking note of those, and we'll hopefully be able to get to everyone's questions after. So now we're going to go to our next speaker of the night, Dr. Katie Pelch. She is an environmental health science and policy analyst and assistant professor at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. Working with NGOs, state agencies, and pollution impacted communities, Dr. Pelch works to improve human health by reducing human and environmental exposure to chemicals that interfere with healthy hormone function. Dr. Pelch's research focuses on data synthesis methods to catalog the existing health and toxicological literature for classes of chemicals such as bisphenols and PFAS. The result of these efforts inform risk assessment and policy decisions. Dr. Pelch has been particularly engaged in ongoing activities to regulate PFAS in drinking water across the US. I will now turn it over to Dr. Pelch for her presentation, and similar to provided in the chat with Dusty's, I'll also provide links to Dr. Katie Pelch's work and things she'll reference in her presentation.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Let me get my screen shared. All right, I can't see, so hopefully you can hear me and see everything okay. All right, I'm going to assume so. So thank you so much again for the invitation to participate in tonight's webinar. It's really an honor to be with you. As you mentioned, I'm a part-time assistant professor at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. I'm located in Fort Worth, Texas. And prior to this appointment, I was a senior scientist at the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, which is also known as TEDx. And some of you may be familiar with our work because of our organization's pioneering work on oil, gas, and fracking issues. While at TEDx, I began to work on evaluating the health impacts of a class of chemicals called PFAS, which are obviously the focus of our webinar tonight. So my talk is going to focus a little bit more on the health impacts of PFAS and not so much on the fracking side. But at the end, I hope to share with you some of the resources for how you can take action to protect yourself and your community from PFAS. There we go. As we heard from Dusty, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances and represents a large class of synthetic man-made chemicals that confer non-stick, grease-proof, waterproof, and stain-proof properties to numerous consumer and industrial products. On this slide, I've chosen just a few representative products to show you the wide variety of items that likely contain one or more PFAS chemicals, including rainwear, stain-proof carpets, food packaging, and even personal care products like dental floss and cosmetics. We also heard that PFAS have many industrial uses, and one that was a primary focus and has received a lot of attention is the use of PFAS in firefighting foams. When PFAS are used in this capacity, they can cause widespread contamination of the soil, ground, and surface waters. And it's important to consider that some of these waters may be used as drinking water sources in communities. And as all of you know, thanks to the great work by Dusty and his team, PFAS have also had a long history of use in the oil and gas industry, which we just heard about. And beyond being used in the fracking process, we know that PFAS firefighting foams have been used on fires and emergencies that have occurred at oil and gas sites or facilities. And even beyond that, what is also concerning, at least here in Texas, where I'm located, is that PFAS waste are actively being shipped from out of state for disposal here in Texas by deep well injection, which in my understanding would be similar to deep wells that are drilled for oil and gas fracking, though I admit I am not an expert on this waste disposal topic, and I welcome feedback as to the similarity and differences between waste wells and fracking wells and the risks that each of those pose. So what are these PFAS? We heard already, but I'll give you another little overview in case these are new to you chemicals. But PFAS are highly fluorinated man-made chemicals. This means that they do not exist naturally in our environment. So the ones that are there have been put there by us. PFAS do look similar to our body's naturally occurring fatty acids, except that everywhere where you would expect to see a hydrogen atom bound to a carbon, industry has replaced them with fluorine. And it's this carbon fluorine or CF bond that is one of the strongest bonds that we know of. And it's this super strong bond and all the resulting characteristics that it imparts on these chemicals that has led these chemicals to be nicknamed forever chemicals. As synthetic chemicals, PFAS have their origins in the Manhattan Project, and commercial use started in the 1940s. The most well-known examples of PFAS include PFOA, which I've shown on the slide here, in which was used in the production of Teflon, and then also PFAS, PFOS, which was used in the fabric treatment Scotchgard. Since this time, the class of known PFAS has grown to several thousand, somewhere between perhaps 4,000 and 9,000 different related chemicals. PFAS represent a public health perfect storm because these chemicals are persistent, meaning they do not break down in the environment. Accumulative, meaning they build up in bodies and in the environment. Mobile, meaning they don't stay in one place once they're released into the world. And hazardous, because they're associated with a variety of health concerns, such as altered immune system and kidney and testicular cancer. We're going to go into these health concerns a little bit more in my talk. Importantly, though, even given all of these concerns around this class of PFAS, there are no federal or national regulations limiting their use in products or directing their cleanup, for example, from drinking water or soil. Rather, the EPA has set a lifetime health advisory for drinking water for just two PFAS, PFOA, which I've shown here, and its very close similar cousin, PFAS, PFOS. Because of their unchecked and widespread use over decades and their persistence and mobility, PFAS are found throughout our environment. In addition to direct exposure from our use of consumer products like those cosmetics that contain PFAS, there are multiple other ways in which PFAS end up in our food, our water, and our air, and ultimately result in human exposure. This figure highlights both these direct exposures and indirect exposure pathways from our environment. PFAS really are a global problem. So this isn't just limited to the US, although I'm only showing the US on this slide. But their presence in drinking water is especially concerning given that we all consume water daily. Recent testing of drinking water by Consumer Reports found detectable levels of PFAS in 117 of 120 tested samples. And they calculate that this represents approximately 19 million Americans that would be impacted. So on this slide, I'm sharing an interactive map that is maintained by the Environmental Working Group, which plots known PFAS contamination sites. And you might look at the map and say, wow, there's a lot of PFAS in some of those states. Places like North Carolina, Michigan, Colorado, California, up the coast in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And there is, but really the truth is that nearly everywhere scientists and state agencies look, they detect at least some PFAS. There are other states like where I am here in Texas and where several of you said you were from in Kansas and Arizona and Pennsylvania, where the state agencies just simply have not begun to look. And so in the absence of a federally enforceable limit on PFAS, many communities such as mine here in Texas and where many of you are joining from are left unprotected. So given the widespread use of PFAS in products and the widespread detection in the environment, it's not surprising that the CDC in the National Health and Nutrition Survey has found PFAS in virtually all Americans they've tested. And even this testing was very limited because the NHANES study doesn't even test for all of the PFAS that we know are in the environment. But we do have alternative methods for detecting PFAS in blood, and these alternative methods are unidentified PFAS in blood samples. And this result suggests that people are being exposed to new and unidentified PFAS. We're going to come back to these new PFAS in a little bit, but first I want to really focus in on what we know about the health impacts that are associated with the most well-known PFAS, in particular PFOA. A lot of what we know about the health effects of PFAS exposure is a result of the tireless work of an attorney, Mr. Rob Bilott, and the exposed community in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And I saw several of you mention in the chat, but if you are interested in this story at all, it has been documented in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood movies, which I've shown here, so please check those out. But very briefly, again, in the 1990s, a farmer suspected that the creek on his property was the dumping site of toxic chemicals from neighboring DuPont Chemical Company. And unfortunately, the farmer, Mr. Tennant, could not get anyone to listen to his concerns that not only were his herd of cattle ill, but much of the local wildlife as well. And thankfully, the attorney, Mr. Bilott, heard these concerns. And even though he usually represented large chemical companies like DuPont, he decided to take the case. And as they say, the rest is history. It was uncovered through these proceedings that DuPont was releasing a then unknown chemical, PFOA, the one that I showed a few slides ago, into the creek that ran through Mr. Tennant's farm. And after many long legal battles, an agreement was reached to study the drinking water and the health impacts of the communities that were nearby. The result was one of the largest community-based human epidemiological studies to date, with nearly 70,000 residents agreeing to participate by providing their blood samples and submitting their private health data for the study. This study is often called the C8 health study because PFOA has a backbone of 8 carbons, so that's where the C8 comes from. And it serves as a strong basis for what we currently know today about the health impacts of not just PFOA, but other similar PFAS chemicals as well. And those health impacts are summarized again in this cartoon. This cartoon indicates or highlights that PFOA is a systemic toxicant because it disrupts many different bodily organs and systems. It disrupts growth and development, immune system function, most notably in a reduced response to vaccines, particularly well studied in children. And it disrupts hormone systems, most notably the thyroid and thyroid hormone signaling. PFOA also disrupts cholesterol and other lipid levels, triglycerides. It's associated with liver damage and is even linked to kidney and testicular cancer. But scientists don't rely just on the results of that C8 study, the big 70,000 person study from Parkersburg, West Virginia. There's actually a large body of human research, as well as experimental animal research that supports the conclusions that are depicted here. And time and again, authoritative government agencies have reviewed the health impacts associated with PFOA and PFAS. And across the board, they consistently find that PFOA is a hazardous chemical. Unfortunately, despite acknowledging that PFOA exposure is associated with health harms, very few actions have been taken at the national level to limit our exposures. Rather, as the pressure was heating up and the focus was being focused on PFOA and its close chemical cousin PFAS, the industry just moved to structurally similar chemicals, like the ones listed on the right here. And initial data has shown that these newer chemicals, sometimes referred to as short chain chemicals because they have fewer carbons, so 6 or fewer carbons. Initial data has shown that these replacement chemicals are just as harmful as the chemicals that they replaced. And this is often referred to as a situation of regrettable substitution. And unfortunately, it just happens a lot in toxics work. We try to get the bad chemical out, but it's easier for industry to replace it with a structurally very similar chemical without having to change their process or change much about the product that they're making, or sacrifice any of the properties that it is contributing to their final product. So making only these minor changes allows the industry to keep moving and to evade that further scrutiny because they've moved away from the harmful chemicals. But we really don't know much about the new chemicals that they've moved to. Unfortunately, because these chemicals also share a lot of structural similarity with what are sometimes referred to as legacy chemicals, they often have the same impact on our bodies. Given the growing concern about the health impacts of these replacement chemicals, my team and I decided that we were going to systematically collect all of the available health and toxicological studies for a subset of those replacement PFAS. And we started out by writing up and publishing our plan in a journal article you can see here. And I admit when we started this, we didn't know what we were going to uncover, but we didn't expect it to take as long or to uncover as many studies as we did. The result of this effort was the creation of the PFAS-TOX Database, which I'm showing here. The PFAS-TOX Database is, oh, I'm sorry, somebody joined. Can you please put yourself on mute? We're getting some background. So the PFAS-TOX Database is actually an interactive database. When you go to the website, you can use filters and change exactly what it is you're seeing. But the idea is that you can get a high-level picture of the amount of research conducted on all of these various PFAS chemicals, and then also drill down into the database to find specific studies on different health outcomes or health topics. We released the first iteration of the PFAS-TOX database in April of this year, and we're getting ready to release an update within the next few months. This database is meant to serve as a resource for quickly finding the peer-reviewed health and toxicological studies that have been published on these 29 different most commonly studied PFAS. And so you'll see that the PFAS outcomes are categorized here across the top. And that, let me back up. What we typically refer to this as a heat map, and the number in each cell represents the number of studies for that PFAS and health outcome combination. And it's a heat map because if there are more studies in a column, then it's a darker color than if there are fewer studies. And the data is color coded so that human studies are always shown in green, animal studies are in blue, and in vitro studies are in orange. And I'm happy to follow up with folks after the meeting if you need a tutorial to walk through this tool. But when you do visit the website, there is a very helpful help button. And on the right side of your screen, when you visit the tool, there are a number of filters that you can dig in and play with the data and explore exactly what has been published so far. A couple of things to note is that this database just includes all studies. So just because there is a number here, it doesn't mean that that there was a significant effect. So we've included studies that report an association and studies where they looked for an association, but there wasn't one, or there was a negative association. So it's just alerting you that a study was conducted on that PFAS and that health outcome category. Another important thing to note are these sort of blank places. And I want to say that just because there are blank spaces, that doesn't mean that those PFAS don't cause those health concerns. It's just that scientists have not looked for a connection between that PFAS and that health concern yet. So if we take a step back, what I hope you can appreciate is that for some chemicals, there has already been a considerable amount of research that has been conducted, especially for health concerns that we know are related, are similar for PFOA, things like the metabolic and digestive system, the impacts on the liver and the triglycerides and cholesterol, and the immune system function and the endocrine system. So for some chemicals, those have already been well studied, but there are many newer chemicals that we know are in the marketplace and perhaps in the environment that have not been subject to that same level of scrutiny yet. So there's a lot of data in that database, and I couldn't possibly summarize it all in just 25 minutes. To tell you that we started not knowing what we were going to get. In the first iteration, which is what I was showing in that screenshot, we included 742 studies. And when we release our update in the coming months with studies that were published just from May of 2019 to early January of 2021, I expect that when we're done, there will be over 1,000 studies. And so how do we distill all of this down and figure out what it actually means for our health? Thankfully, some of our government agencies have started to do this, even though keeping up with all of the new studies just really isn't feasible for them, as new research is published all the time. And even though these same agencies or their related agencies who serve regulatory functions are actually seemingly paralyzed from taking action. One agency's work that I do want to highlight here, though, is the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or the ATSDR. The results on this slide summarize the findings that ATSDR put out in draft form in 2018 and then finalized in 2020. I don't know why I stumbled on that. What we see indicated by the X's in this table is that PFOA and PFAS, those two most well-known and well-studied PFAS, are associated with health impacts on the immune system, including that decreased response to vaccines. They are associated with developmental and reproductive concerns, including pregnancy-induced hypertension, which is also referred to as preeclampsia. They are associated with increases in serum lipids, that's your cholesterol, and liver, increase in serum enzymes, and decreases in serum bilirubin levels, effects on the thyroid and thyroid signaling, altered body weight, and decreased red blood cell count and other blood chemistry parameters. So we know that for PFOA and PFAS. What about some of those other newer chemicals that are well studied? If I add those into the chart here, what I hope you can appreciate is that when the research has been conducted, what we find is that many of these new or replacement type chemicals or other PFAS that are either now or have historically been in the environment share many of the same health concerns as PFOA and PFAS have. And then again, the absence of an X marking a health concern doesn't necessarily mean that the PFAS isn't associated with that health outcome. It's just, it may be the case that those studies have not yet been conducted. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is that there are a growing number of both human and animal studies that demonstrate that we know enough about these PFAS chemicals to take action now. We have to turn off the tap on PFAS. Literally, we have to get them out of our drinking water. And we need to phase out non-essential uses of PFAS in consumer and industrial products. And while we're doing all that, we're working to get PFAS out of our water and our products, we have to start taking action to remediate our air, our soil, and our water. One thing we know for sure is doing this one single chemical at a time will never get us anywhere. This is why my colleagues and I have written about the need to manage PFAS as a class. The US regulatory system, however, and the state regulatory systems are not built for this. And even though this would be the most health protective approach, it has been difficult to get governments on board, but we're trying. The upside is that some consumer-facing businesses have pledged to move away from the entire class of PFAS, and state legislatures have been successful in banning the entire class of PFAS from some select consumer product sectors, for example, food packaging. And at this point, I know I saw in the chat earlier, but I'm sure many of you are wondering how you can best protect yourself and your families from exposure to PFAS chemicals. And though it can be very difficult to completely avoid PFAS because of our background exposures and that they're used in just so many of our day-to-day products, there are some meaningful actions that you can take. The first that most people want to know about is how to get your water tested. And I will say, unfortunately, this is not a cheap test, but you can order a test by visiting mytapscore.com and looking under specialized tests for the PFAS test. And if you get results back that indicate you do have PFAS in your drinking water, I want to encourage you to reach out to the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. This is a grassroots organization of PFAS impacted communities across the entire US that have come together to help each other understand the impacts of their exposure and also to advocate on behalf of themselves and others to policymakers that hold the power, hopefully, to make meaningful change. You can also choose to filter your water. Oops, there we go. And it seems that most of the scientists that I work with recommend either a whole home filter or a point source filter at the tap. Again, these can be expensive solutions and they may not be feasible to everyone or to those who don't own their own homes. Or it might not be right given your local water chemistry for some of these different types of filters, which is why I recommend the Environmental Working Group as a resource on how to find the right filter for your specific location and water needs. You can also avoid PFAS when you shop, and I've included a link here to PFAS-free products, which is curated by the Green Science Policy Institute. And finally, one of the easiest ways to avoid PFAS is to avoid eating fast food or takeout food, microwave popcorn, these types of foods that we know where PFAS either currently are or have historically been used in the packaging materials. Their use in these types of materials is not disclosed to us. And even if one store or brand or chain has said that they are going to phase it out, there currently is not testing to document that. So it's really best to avoid these types of food packaging materials altogether. In bigger ways to reduce PFAS exposure, I'd also like to invite you all to help protect not only the health of your family, but also families in your communities that perhaps can't install water filters or don't have access to bottled water or just aren't yet aware of this growing problem. For example, you can participate in campaigns that are aimed at moving the consumer marketplace away from the use of PFAS. The Mind the Store campaign does a lot of good work in this area, and you can sign up for their listserv to learn more. You can also contact your local water supplier if your water is from a municipal source rather than a private well, and ask them and bother them to test the water and filter the water. And I know several of you are from Pennsylvania, and I saw recently that your state representatives are already aware about the PFAS and drinking water issue, but unfortunately, they seem to really be dragging their feet on taking any action. And they recently shared that it's likely to be another 2 years before regulations are set. In the meantime, at least 10 other states have set health protective either goals or regulations. And one of the points that we often make is that decisions that are delayed are health protections that are denied. So a 2-year delay in setting regulations means that communities will be unprotected for at least 2 more years, drinking potentially contaminated water while the state reviews the science and determines a safe level in the drinking water. Both of steps have already been taken in other states. So please reach out to your local city, state, and federal officials and representatives. And my final point is that even though there's been a tremendous amount of research and action taken so far, it's still not enough, especially when communities like your own have been left out. So with that, I will stop there. Thank you again for inviting me tonight. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pelch, for your presentation and sharing your knowledge with all of us. And again, thank you to Dusty Horwitt as well for his presentation earlier. We are so fortunate to have you both here tonight. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for joining us this evening. We are now going to move towards the Q&A portion of the night. However, in case anyone needs to jump off now or early, I just want to share some additional information. We will be putting some resources in the chat that you can utilize from EHP with more information about protecting your health, as well as information related to our discussions tonight. For additional information on shale gas development and the impacts on health, you can also check out our website, our social media, and you can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter as well as our quarterly healthcare provider newsletter. So I will put all of those in the chat for everyone, but we will go ahead and get started with our Q&A. I'm gonna kind of try and switch back and forth to questions that were asked during Dusty's portion and then Dr. Pelch, but please, both of you feel free to chime in whenever. I'm sure you both have knowledge on all of these questions. So one of the first ones during your presentation, Dusty, was how or why are PFAS used in oil and gas extraction, more specifically, like at what stage, and do we know if they're used at all in pipeline construction?
That's a good question. It's a little bit difficult to know from the records. We looked at the FRAC-focused database, as I mentioned, that includes well-by-well fracking disclosure for, I think, about 175,000 wells. And in some cases, the use was listed next to the chemicals we identified as PFAS or PFAS precursors. One of the uses was surfactant. That's fairly general, but a surfactant is, like, an example of a surfactant would be a soap. Its technical definition is that Katie can probably correct me here, but it reduces the surface tension between two liquids, I think. And you might use a surfactant for friction reduction in fracking. Fracking is conducted under very high pressure, sometimes as high as 10,000 pounds per square inch of pressure that the companies use to force the fracking fluid out of the well pipe and into the formation to fracture the underground formations. And so if they can reduce the friction in that well pipe, they can save energy. They don't have to use as much diesel fuel to generate that massive pressure in the well pipe. So surfactant is one use. Some of these chemicals were listed as a tracer. Tracers are used to help oil and gas companies infer things about underground formations. For example, oftentimes companies will drill a horizontal well, which goes down and then turns and goes out horizontally, and they will fracture the underground formation at multiple points along that horizontal leg. And so what they might do is inject a different tracer in each of those different fracks along the horizontal leg. And then when the natural gas or oil comes back up the drilling pipe and is produced, they'll check to see which of those tracers is included in the oil and gas that gets produced. So then they can infer that like the fourth fracking job on that horizontal returned a lot of oil because they got a lot of that particular tracer back. And maybe the fifth one returned almost nothing because there were hardly any of the tracers injected in that fifth frac that came back up to the surface. So surfactants, tracers are a couple of uses that we've seen in fracking. So we looked at 2 scientific papers that we found about the use of PFAS. One was a survey of the use of PFAS across all different industries. The other was about the use of fluorinated surfactants in oil and gas drilling. And those papers indicated that surfactants might also be used in drilling that precedes fracking. I can't recall offhand exactly why they would use it. And then a fourth use would be what was identified as potentially in a extraction process called water flooding, which is used to produce oil, in which companies flood an underground formation with water to force out the oil. And in that case, the PFAS, according to this paper, was used to basically slip the formation to facilitate the flow of oil, relying on the oil resistant properties of PFAS. So that's a decent answer, I hope, to your question.
Thank you. This next question can kind of go towards both of you. Is the risk from PFAS from fracking different from the exposure from everyday products?
I can take a stab at this one. The 2 different ways to answer this. One, they are likely different chemicals. And so, yes, there is a possibility that the health concerns associated with those chemicals might be different. In this case, especially with the chemicals that Dusty uncovered, they're probably even larger than some of the larger chemical compounds than the ones that I've included in the PFAS-TOX database and that the ATSDR covered. But we're not quite sure how they break down. And in the environment, they may break down to some of the more well-known PFAS. So there's one concern. And then certainly the level of exposure is a large concern. And I don't think that there has been enough data or research yet to say, are they equivalent concerns, or are we getting most of our exposure from fracking, living near fracking and having these chemicals potentially in our water and in our soil versus from these other types of day-to-day exposures that are in our household items.
Thank you. This is a little bit more of a general question in terms of PFAS. Do we know, where is PFAS manufactured? And then kind of how did we come to learn it is being used with fracking?
I missed the last part of the question, so I'll leave the fracking question to Dusty, but we do know many manufacturers of PFAS. DuPont spun off Chemours as a large producer of PFAS. There are also several other industries who operate in the US and globally that make PFAS for a wide variety of products.
I'm sorry, I missed the second question too. I think you broke up a little bit there.
Sorry about that. The second part of the question was, how do we learn about their use in fracking?
How do we learn?
Did we kind of both?
So let me just piggyback on Katie's answer briefly and say that despite the confidentiality claims in the EPA documents that we looked at, including a trade secret protection for the name of the company that submitted the chemicals for review to EPA, we were able to decipher by looking at other EPA records that the likely submitter of those 3 chemicals proposed for use in drilling or fracking was DuPont, in part because Chemours, which is DuPont's spinoff, was listed in some other EPA documents as an importer or manufacturer of these of the chemical that went of the three that went into commercial production. And so Chemours, if Chemours was an importer or manufacturer during a particular period of time where they made the disclosure, they did not exist as a separate company during that period of time. So we deduced that likely it was DuPont that originally submitted the chemical. You can read about this in our report because it's a little complicated. And to address the second question, how do we find out that they're being used? Basically through that EPA document, I didn't think to look to see whether PFAS were used in oil and gas drilling until I examined more closely this EPA document where the regulators said they were worried that these oil and gas chemicals could break down into a PFOA-like substance. And it was the fact that I watched the movie Dark Waters about Rob Bilot's PFOA-related lawsuit sort of tripped my subconscious and made me remember that I had seen that four-letter acronym PFOA in these documents, and that caused me to go back into the documents. So I have to thank Mark Ruffalo and the others who were involved and Rob Bilot who were involved in making that movie for leading us down this path. And then from there, after reviewing those documents, we dived into the Frac Focus database and found those other chemicals that are PFAS or likely PFAS or PFAS precursors.
Thank you. This next question goes more towards Katie's presentation. What federal moves are currently being made, if you know of any, to strengthen or create something stronger than the TSCA?
What federal actions are being taken to create something stronger than the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA?
Yes.
I believe that was the question. So that's a really big question. And I admit that most of my work focuses at the state level. So I'm not 100% up to speed at the federal level. But most of the work on PFAS is actually outside of TSCA and focused more on the NDAA, which is the National Defense Fund authorization, something about the budget for the military, because PFAS have a strong and complicated history of development within the Department of Defense and use at military sites in firefighting foam. And so a lot of the focus on PFAS at the federal level is there's discussion there. There's discussion in a lot of realms. There's definitely discussion about how to regulate PFAS in drinking water. I'm not sure that advocates on the ground have confidence that that is going to happen soon. There was another one that came to my mind, and there were several PFAS that were reported in the recent release of the TRI data, which is the toxics reporting list. And so there are some analyses underway of that data as well. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm more of a state focused person right now. I'm not quite ready for that question.
No worries at all. Thank you. This is a more general question, but do you know, is there any history of these chemicals, PFAS, being added to pet food?
I don't know that they would be necessarily added as a food additive. That's kind of a whole different ball of wax, but they are found in packaging for pet food, just like they are found in the packaging of a lot of our food products as well.
Thank you. This question came off of Dusty's presentation. So looking at fracking, wastewater, produced water, and brine, and are all three of those the same thing? And then also like, what can we do to combat misinformation that brine is just salt water?
So fracking wastewater, produced water, and brine. So the way I would use those terms would be basically, to just take a step back, when after fracking is complete, the companies turn off the pressure in the well, and the flow of the fluid that they injected into the well reverses. And that fracking fluid, a portion of the fracking fluid, comes up and out of the well. That is followed by water mixed with, and then is followed by water from the formation. I would call water from the formation, if I were being very technical about it, produced water, as opposed to the fracking fluid that was injected. But I think oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably: wastewater, produced water, brine. I think that they often are used to mean the same thing. But if I were using the terms, I guess I would say wastewater is sort of the umbrella term, and then produced water and brine, I would probably say, are from the formation as opposed to the fracking fluid that comes up out of the well. If you think that an agency, a company is using those terms in a specific way, I think it would be important to ask them to clarify, because there can be some significant implications if they're being used not interchangeably. For example, I recently asked some scientists about testing wastewater for PFAS, and they said it would be very difficult because if PFAS were used in fracking fluid, that fluid is likely going to come out of the well initially in the total volume of wastewater. So if you didn't test that initial production of wastewater, you probably would not find PFAS, even though PFAS might have been used in the well. So if somebody says, let's test the produced water in the well, if they're using that term very specifically to mean the formation water that comes up after the fracking fluid, then that probably is not going to include PFAS if PFAS were used in the fracking, even though PFAS could be contained in the wastewater as a whole. I hope that's clear. And then, I'm sorry, the second part of the question was what?
Just how we can combat the misinformation around like brine just being salt water.
Right. Well, there are studies out there. I think the one that first comes to mind for me is, and from an impeccable source, is from the U.S. Geological Survey, that found very high levels of radium in wastewater from the Marcellus Shale. Then also a very credible source is EPA's 2016 study of fracking and drinking water, which identified more than 1,600 chemicals in wastewater and fracking fluid. And it detailed that some of these chemicals are toxic, including radium, as well as BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. So I might start by emphasizing those two sources. I can guide you to them if you need help on that, and then educate people in your community about that. Local media, organizations of health professionals who can help get the word out.
Thank you. So I guess kind of our last question I have for both of you is just, Obviously, we talked about a lot of information tonight. So what is something you'd like people to take? You both can answer the main takeaway from your presentation, or something that people can do to help around the conversation of PFAS, any kind of recommendations or things like that. I guess final words you want to share with us.
I think my main take home is that these chemicals need to be managed and addressed and regulated as a class, because so many of them share all of these common characteristics, that they're persistent, they're mobile, they are hazardous and toxic. So we have got to speak up. We need to reach out to all of our representatives and our public health agencies and get them engaged in the conversation and hold them accountable when they say that they are going to take action and they delay that action. We need to be involved in those conversations and continuing to push the narrative forward. Thanks again for the invite to present tonight.
I would agree with that. And I would say I'd like people to know that these chemicals are extremely toxic, bioaccumulative, and persistent in the environment. And because of that, they have no business being used in a process as risky and unpredictable as oil and gas extraction. And so people should organize in their communities, contact their local elected officials, and advocate for prohibitions on oil and gas drilling near where people live and get their drinking water, better disclosure of these chemicals, and a ban on the use of these chemicals in oil and gas extraction as a class, as Katie mentioned. And some of the recommendations for reform that are applicable to PFAS can be found in that report from the Pennsylvania Attorney General, including recommendations for greater setbacks for oil and gas operations from where people live, and full disclosure of chemicals used in drilling and fracking. And thank you again for including me tonight.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your time. And for everyone who joined us, I'm going to turn it over to Jamala now to close us out for the night.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending tonight's event. Thank you to Dusty and Katie and Mackenzie for your time here tonight and all the great information that you have shared. As has been shared in the chat, we will be compiling notes and links and sending the replays to you once this event is over. So expect that in the next couple of days. We will also be posting information as well to the Halt the Harm websites, as well as to the Environmental Health Project websites. And so I just want to share a last couple of things with you all as far as where you can find the replay on the Halt the Harm website. You'll be able to find the replay under our webinars section if you go under past webinars. Also, if you want to learn more about the Environmental Health Project, you can go to their website, and that's environmentalhealthproject.org for more information on their efforts. We've also got some great resources at Fracking Next Door, and you can get information there if you have any questions about fracking. We've also got a Fracking Help Center where you can use our knowledge base to get more resources as well. And then we, again, want to continue to build the national network to stop fracking. So if you aren't already part of the Halt the Harm network, please join our directory for leaders so that you can get connected and get plugged in. And thank you all so much for attending this evening's webinar. Remember, you'll get a brief survey. And if you have any ideas or suggestions for future trainings, then you can feel free to email Ryan at Halt the Harm. Many of you all know him, and also just some other websites for you as well. So thank you again for attending and have a great weekend, everyone.